There was a time when Milbrook, Pennsylvania, was just another quiet dot on the map, a God-fearing hamlet where the days moved slow and the dead were buried fast. But in the year 1823, something ancient and evil lived among the pines, something that wore the mask of decency while feasting on the flesh of trust and tradition. At the top of the hill overlooking the village sat the Hartwell funeral parlor, a solemn house of stone and shadow where grief was supposed to be met with compassion. But what the town never suspected was that its most respected family had turned the sanctuary of the dead into a laboratory of suffering. Ezekiel Hartwell. The patriarch was known as a man of integrity, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a skilled undertaker. His hands prepared the dead with reverence. Or so they believed. Martha, his wife, was a beacon of charitable grace, tending to widows and orphans. With a matron's calm voice and sharp eyes, their sons, Josiah and Caleb, carried the coffins of the departed with quiet strength. And even the youngest daughter, Rebecca, inspired admiration for her innocence and beauty. It was the perfect facade, and like all perfect lies, it hid horrors beyond imagining. No one ever questioned why the Hartwells rarely traveled, or why their funeral parlor was always full even in times of health. No one noticed how families mourning their dead seemed subdued, not just by grief, but by something they couldn't name, an invisible chill that followed them home and clung to them in the night. But Thomas Creed noticed. He was old, stubborn, and half-blind, but his instincts remained sharp. He had worked in the parlor for 20 years, and what he saw in his final months terrified him. Strange sounds in the night, faint cries beneath the floorboards, supplies that vanished and reappeared, bloodstains that never matched the cause of death, and once, the unmistakable smell of fresh decay on a body already embalmed when Creed spoke to the town doctor Elias Harrison. His voice trembled, not from age but from knowing he had uncovered something not meant to be seen. He begged the physician to investigate, to dig beneath the stone and silence, and find the truth. What began as suspicion would soon become revelation, and what Harrison found would unravel everything Milbrook believed about life, death, and the sanctity of family. The house on the hill was not a sanctuary, it was a slaughterhouse. Dr. Elias Harrison was not a man prone to superstition or panic. He had studied under some of the finest medical minds in Philadelphia and returned to Milbrook with the quiet confidence of a man who trusted reason over rumor he had examined. Bodies of the plague dead, he had delivered children into breathless silence and watched them take their first cry. And he believed firmly in cause and effect, science and evidence. But what Thomas Creed whispered to him in the back of the town chapel during a stormy Sunday morning shook something deep inside him. Creed spoke of bodies that arrived looking one way and left looking another, of internal organs, misplaced, missing, or marked with strange incisions that no embalming practice could justify. He spoke of laughter, heard from the basement at midnight, of children brought to the parlor and never seen again, of ledgers that didn't add up, and of a trapdoor behind the embalming table that had no visible key and no reason to exist. Harrison listened carefully, nodding politely, but inside, he wrestled with disbelief and dread, because Creed was not known for storytelling, and the fear in the old man's eyes was not imagined. 3 nights later, Harrison found himself standing outside the funeral parlor, under a moonless sky, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum of judgment. He had told no one, not even his wife. For this visit was not official. It was driven by something deeper, a pull he could not explain, as if the town itself was demanding answers, demanding blood. He knocked, but no one came. Lights flickered inside, but the house remained still. He circled the building, noting the careful stonework, the darkened windows, the faint hum of something mechanical beneath the soil. Then he saw it, a soft glow leaking from beneath the cellar door, and footsteps crunching in the leaves behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing, only the wind whispering rough the trees and the faint scent of embalming fluid riding the air like a curse. The door was locked, but Harrison made a silent promise to return not as a visitor, but as an investigator, armed with authority and knowledge, and Creed's trembling warnings etched into his mind like scripture. Something was wrong at the Hartwell house, deeply wrong, and he intended to carve through the lies until he reached its beating heart. It was a gray Thursday morning when Dr. Elias Harrison arrived at the Hartwell funeral parlor under official order from the County Health Board. The town watched with cautious curiosity as he stepped from his carriage, medical bag in hand, black coat flapping in the wind like a raven's wing. His expression unreadable and his purpose clear. He was not there for condolences. He was there for truth. And truth has a scent that cannot be masked with flowers and hymns. Ezekiel Hartwell greeted him at the door with practiced politeness, his eyes betraying nothing but calm hospitality. Martha stood just behind her husband, hands folded apron, spotless smile, too still, too rehearsed. The children lingered in the hallway, their gazes sharp and unblinking. Josiah, tall and muscular. Caleb, narrow and pale. Rebecca standing quietly as if she were not seen unless she wished to be. The family seemed perfectly normal, painfully so, and that was the first sign something was deeply wrong. Dr. Harrison moved through the rooms with clinical detachment, taking notes on sanitation, storage, embalming tools, and procedures. Everything appeared to meet or even exceed the standards of the time. Clean, efficient, respectable. He examined the embalming table, the chemical shelf, the ice storage in the basement, all orderly, all in place. But it was too perfect, too staged. No smell, no mistake, no trace of the wear that real work always leaves behind. When he asked about body intake logs, Martha produced them without hesitation. But something about the pages felt off, too consistent, too symmetrical. The handwriting never changed over 20 years. The ink faded in identical ways, the entries too neat, too exact. Harrison made a mental note. This was no mere sloppiness. It was a performance, and someone had practiced their part well. In the preparation room, he found the oddest thing, a stain beneath the table, faint reddish brown, scrubbed on, early to invisibility, but not quite. He ran his gloved fingers across the stone and felt the faint drag of dried protein, a trace overlooked or left intentionally. And as he turned to question Ezekiel, the old man was already watching him with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The inspection ended without incident. But as he left the house, Harrison felt a weight settle on his shoulders, a silent pressure that followed him to the edge of town and did not leave, even after he crossed into daylight again. He had found nothing, and yet he had seen too much. He knew what a house of death should feel like, and this place felt like. It was waiting to feed again. 2 nights after the inspection, Dr. Harrison was awoken by a knock at his door. Not frantic, not loud, but rhythmic, deliberate, a signal known only to those who truly feared being seen. When he opened the door, Thomas Creed stood trembling, pale, soaked from the rain, eyes darting like a hunted animal. He clutched something wrapped in oilcloth, and when Harrison gestured him inside, the old man hesitated, as if even the room might be listening. Creed sat without speaking for several minutes, staring into the fireplace, his hands gripping the bundle so tightly, his knuckles whitened when he finally spoke. It was in a whisper, brittle and cracked, like dry leaves underfoot. He said he had served the Hartwell family for nearly 20 years. Embalmer, assistant, laborer, errand boy. He had buried more than just bodies. He said he had buried secrets. buried them deep beneath stone and silence. But the weight had grown too much. He handed Harrison the oilcloth bundle. Inside were pages yellowed and smudged, entries written in multiple hands. Recording methods. Chemicals, dosages, reactions. A ledger of death disguised as medical study, each victim named, each experiment catalogued. The tone of the writing was clinical, detached, even proud, and the signatures were unmistakable. Ezekiel, Josiah, Caleb, even Rebecca and Martha had signed their works, as if they were artists, presenting a gallery of horrors. Creed described a hidden chamber beneath the funeral home. A place no inspector had ever seen, a place where experiments were conducted on the living, where poisons were tested on the dying, where organs were preserved like trophies. He spoke of travelers who were taken, of children whose deaths were blamed on fever, of old widows who were robbed before their final breath, their valuables divided among the family like inheritance of sin. His voice broke when he spoke of the noises at night, the muffled cries, the laughter that. Tea came too late and lingered too long, he said. He had tried to leave once. Years ago, but Ezekiel had reminded him of his complicity, had reminded him that the town would never believe an old man who had helped bury the evidence. And so, Creed had stayed year after year, watching the family refine their methods, sharpen their cruelty, erase the line between ritual and routine. But now he was dying, and he wanted someone to know the truth. Someone to stop them before more innocents were fed to their machine of death. He begged Harrison to act, begged him to burn the place to the ground, if that was the only way to stop the cycle. He offered the key to the hidden chamber and swore that everything the doctor needed to prove the family's guilt was hidden behind a false wall in the basement. As the wind howled outside and the fire dimmed, Harrison stared at the man before him and saw not just fear, but shame, and beneath that, a kind of hope, fragile and flickering like the flame between them. And he knew then that the nightmare he had glimpsed was far from over. It was only just beginning. The key Creed had given him was small and ornate, designed to open a hidden compartment behind the basement stone wall. According to the old man, this compartment contained not only the complete murder journal, but also preserved specimens, poison supplies, and detailed anatomical drawings that would provide irrefutable proof of the family's crimes, or importantly, it contained a detailed map showing the location of the hidden burial ground, where dozens of victims had been disposed of over the years as the church bells began to ring across Milbrook. Dr. Harrison positioned himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, watching the family emerge from their home. Dressed in their Sunday finest, Ezekiel wore a black suit that gave him a dignified ministerial appearance, while Martha had chosen a dark blue dress with a white collar that emphasized her matronly respectability. Josiah and Caleb flanked their parents, looking every inch the devoted sons, while Rebecca walked demurely beside her mother, her innocent appearance masking the calculating mind that Creed had described. What Dr. Harrison found most disturbing was how normal the family appeared as they walked toward the church. Their faces showed no trace of the evil that Creed had described, no hint that they had murdered dozens of innocent people over the past 2 decades. They exchanged pleasantries with neighbors along the way, smiled at children playing in yards, and presented themselves as the very model of Christian virtue and family values. The physician waited a full 30 minutes after the family's departure before approaching the funeral home. The building stood silent and imposing in the weak autumn sunlight, its stone walls holding secrets that would shock the entire community if they were revealed. Dr. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he used Thomas Creed's key to enter through the basement door. But his med-I-call training had prepared him for confronting disturbing realities, and he forced himself to proceed methodically. The basement initially appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection. Clean, organized, and professionally maintained, the embalming tables were spotless. The chemical solutions properly labeled and stored, and the few bodies currently in their care lay peacefully under white sheets. It was only when Dr. Harrison began examining the walls more carefully that he located the concealed entrance Creed had described, behind a section of stone wall that appeared identical to the rest of the basement. The small key opened a hidden panel that revealed a chamber of horrors beyond his worst imaginings. The secret room was larger than the main basement, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house and into the hillside beyond. Shelves lined the walls containing hundreds of glass jars filled with preserved human organs, each carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be experimental notations. The murder journal occupied a place of honor on a wooden lectern in the center of the room. The leather-bound volume was thick, with years of entries written in multiple hands, but with consistent attention to detail that spoke of scientific methodology applied to the act of murder. Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to understand the technical aspects of what he was reading, but the clinical precision with which the family had documented their crimes was perhaps more horrifying than the murders themselves. Each entry followed a similar format: identification of the victim, method of approach, technique employed for killing, observations about the victim's reactions, and notes for future reference. The entries revealed a progression from simple poisonings to increasingly sophisticated methods that suggested years of practice and refinement. Recent entries showed experiments with various surgical techniques apparently conducted on living victims to study their effects. What shocked Dr. Harrison most was the discovery that the family's activities extended far beyond Milbrook. The journal documented murders in at least 6 different Pennsylvania townships, with victims selected during the family's travels to provide funeral services for distant clients. They had developed a system for identifying vulnerable individuals in each community, often returning months later to commit crimes in areas where they were less likely to be suspected. The anatomical drawings were even more disturbing than the journal entries. Detailed illustrations showed the progression of various experimental procedures, with careful notations about which techniques produced the most fear in victims and which methods were most effective for different types of people. The drawings suggested that the family viewed their victims not as human beings, but as subjects for scientific study approaching murder with the same methodical precision that legitimate researchers might apply to animal specimens. As Dr. Harrison continued his examination of the hidden chamber, he became aware of voices outside the building, glancing at his pocket watch. He realized with growing alarm that he had been in the basement for over 2 hours, absorbed in documenting the evidence he had discovered. The voices grew louder, and he recognized the distinctive cadence of Ezekiel Hartwell's speech as the family returned from church much earlier than expected. Panic seized Dr. Harrison as he realized his precarious situation. He was trapped in the secret chamber with damning evidence of the family's crimes, and they would certainly kill him if they discovered his presence. The voices moved closer to the building, and he could hear footsteps on the wooden porch above his head. His escape route through the basement door would take him directly into their path, but remaining hidden in the chamber would only delay his discovery until they came to check on their secrets. Just when we thought Dr. Harrison's investigation might expose the horrible truth about the Hartwell family, the situation took a deadly turn. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone who craves darkness and truth. Hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep uncovering the secrets they wanted buried. In his desperate search for an alternative escape route, Dr. Harrison noticed that the secret chamber extended further than he had initially realized. At the far end of the room, partially concealed behind stacks of glass specimen jars, was another door that appeared to lead deeper into the hillside. With the family's voices growing ever closer, he had no choice but to risk exploring this unknown passage. hoping it might lead to freedom rather than deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. The narrow passage behind the specimen chamber led Dr. Harrison through a hand-carved tunnel that extended deep into the hillside behind the Hartwell property. The walls were rough stone carved with simple tools, but showing evidence of years of gradual expansion. As he moved through the tunnel by the light of a candle he had found in the chamber, the physician began to understand the true scope of the Hartwell family's operation. The tunnel opened into a natural cave that had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house. Human remains were scattered throughout the cavern, some carefully arranged on stone shelves, others simply piled in corners, where they had been hastily discarded. The smell of death and decay was overwhelming, but Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment. Despite his horror, what he discovered in that underground cemetery revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. The remains of at least 40 individuals were present in various states of decay, representing decades of systematic murder. Some of the bodies showed evidence of the experimental procedures documented in the journal, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently. Personal effects scattered among the remains, jewelry, clothing, coins, suggested that robbery had indeed been a significant motivation for many of the murders. Most disturbing of all was a section of the cave where recent victims had been displayed, almost like trophies. Dr. Harrison recognized clothing and jewelry belonging to several individuals he had examined during his official inspection, confirming that the Hartwells had been systematically murdering their clients. Rather than simply preparing natural deaths for burial, the clinical arrangement of these bodies suggested that the family visited this underground chamber regularly, perhaps to relive their crimes or to continue their grotesque experiments. As Dr. Harrison documented what he found in the cave, he heard voices echoing through the tunnel. Behind him, the Hartwells had discovered his absence from the inn and had apparently found evidence of his intrusion into their secret chamber. Multiple voices called his name, but their tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters pursuing cornered prey. The cave system proved to have multiple exits, and Dr. Harrison managed to escape through a narrow opening that led to the wooded hillside above the Hartwell property. From this vantage point, he could see the family searching the area around their home, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted such searches before. It became clear that Dr. Harrison was not the first person to discover their secrets, and the methodical way they combed the area suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. The physician's escape from Milbrook required all his knowledge of wilderness survival, and considerable luck. He was forced to abandon his belongings at the inn and travel cross-country toward the nearest substantial town, avoiding roads where the Hartwells might pursue him. His medical bag contained enough documentation to convince authorities, but he needed to reach civilized areas before the family could silence him permanently. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that Thomas Creed had not escaped. As planned, the old man had been discovered, attempting to leave the house, and had been confronted by his family about his betrayal under torture. Creed had revealed everything about his arrangement with Dr. Harrison, including the physician's plans to document their crimes and expose them to authorities. This revelation had prompted the family to return early from church and begin their search for Dr. Harrison. More ominously, it had convinced them that their operation in Milbrook was no longer sustainable, rather than simply eliminating Dr. Harrison and continuing their activities. They had decided to abandon their established base and relocate to a new community where they could start fresh. The Hartwells' departure from Milbrook was as carefully planned as their crimes. They claimed that Ezekiel had received an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, necessitating an immediate journey that might keep them away for several months. The funeral home would be temporarily closed, and they asked neighbors to keep watch over their property during their absence to most of the community. This seemed like a reasonable family emergency that required their sympathy and support. What the townspeople didn't realize was that the Hartwells were methodically destroying evidence of their crimes. Before leaving, the secret chamber was emptied and sealed. The cave system was partially collapsed to hide the remains it contained, and all documentary evidence of their activities was either destroyed or packed for transport to their new location. By the time Dr. Harrison reached authorities in Philadelphia 3 days later, the Hartwell family had vanished completely, leaving behind only an empty funeral home and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. Dr. Harrison's account of what he had discovered was met with skepticism by Philadelphia authorities, who found it difficult to believe that a respected family could have committed such extensive crimes without detection. The physician's evidence was compelling, but much of it had been destroyed or hidden by the time investigators reached Milbrook. The few remains they managed to recover from the partially collapsed cave system were insufficient to support the full scope of Dr. Harrison's accusations. The investigation that followed was hampered by the community's resistance to believing such terrible things about the Hartwell family. Townspeople provided character references for the Hartwells, insisting that they had been generous, caring neighbors who could never have committed the crimes Dr. Harrison described without the family present to question. And with most physical evidence destroyed, authorities were forced to conclude that while suspicious circumstances existed, there was insufficient proof to warrant a massive manhunt. Thomas Creed's disappearance was explained by the family as the wandering of a senile old man who had become confused and lost in the woods. Search parties found no trace of him, and his fate remained officially unknown, though Dr. Harrison had no doubt that Creed had paid the ultimate price for his attempt to expose his family's crimes. The aftermath of Dr. Harrison's discoveries haunted both him and the community of Milbrook for years to come. The physician submitted detailed reports to state authorities, but without the Hartwell family present to question. And with most physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and filed away in the growing bureaucracy of the Pennsylvania state government. Dr. Harrison never stopped believing in what he had witnessed, and he spent considerable personal resources attempting to track down the Hartwell family. His investigations revealed a pattern of similar disappearances and suspicious deaths in several Ohio communities during 1824 and 1825. But by the time he could alert authorities in those areas, the family had once again vanished. Over the following decade, Dr. Harrison documented similar patterns in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, always arriving too late to prevent further murders or capture the perpetrators. The people of Milbrook were left to grapple with the possibility that they had been living alongside systematic murderers for over 2 decades. Some residents refused to believe Dr. Harrison's account, insisting that the Hartwells had been good neighbors who were being falsely accused. Others began to re-examine past deaths with new suspicion, wondering how many of their friends and relatives had actually been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. The Hartwell funeral parlor building stood empty for nearly 2 years before being purchased by a merchant from Philadelphia who converted it into a general store. Local residents were reluctant to enter the building, and it took years for the community to fully accept its new function. The basement was permanently sealed, and no one showed any interest in exploring the cave system that Dr. Harrison had described. Perhaps most tragically, the fear and suspicion created by the Hartwell affair fundamentally changed the character of Milbrook. The trust and openness that had defined the community for generations was replaced by weariness and doubt. Neighbors began viewing each other with suspicion. Death became a source of fear rather than acceptance, and the simple faith that had bound the community together was permanently fractured. Dr. Harrison continued his work as a traveling physician, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed in Milbrook. He developed an almost obsessive attention to detail during his inspections, examining every death with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator rather than a routine health official. His colleagues began to view him as eccentric, even paranoid, but Dr. Harrison knew that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his experience in Milbrook, Dr. Harrison received a letter that would vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a final chilling chapter to the Hartwell story. The letter came from a sheriff in Oregon Territory, where westward expansion had carried thousands of settlers seeking new opportunities in the far reaches of the American frontier. According to the sheriff's account, a family named Caldwell had operated a funeral parlor in a small Oregon settlement for 3 years before being exposed in circumstances remarkably similar to what Dr. Harrison had discovered in Pennsylvania. The sheriff had read Dr. Harrison's old reports in federal files and recognized the identical patterns of suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and hidden burial sites. When authorities had finally raided the Caldwell establishment, they found evidence of at least 30 murders committed over their 3 years in Oregon. More significantly, they discovered documentation proving that the Caldwells were actually the Hartwell family, who had been moving westward across America for over 2 decades, establishing new identities and continuing their murderous practices in each new community. The family had been captured alive, and during their interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning nearly 30 years and covering 8 different states. Their total victim count exceeded 120 individuals, making them among the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now calling himself Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old, but remained mentally sharp and showed no remorse for his crimes. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had all continued their roles in the family operation, refining their techniques and expanding their methods with each relocation. The family's confessions revealed the full scope of their crimes and provided closure for dozens of unsolved disappearances across the frontier. They described in detail how they had perfected their system of selecting victims, establishing credibility in new communities, and disposing of evidence. Most chillingly, they expressed pride in their accomplishments, viewing themselves as successful entrepreneurs who had simply chosen an unusual line of business. Ezekiel Hartwell was executed by hanging in Salem, Oregon in December 1847. Followed by his wife Martha and son, Josiah. Caleb was sentenced to life imprisonment where he died of pneumonia. In 1852, Rebecca, who was still relatively young and claimed to have been coerced by her family, received a 20-year sentence, but died in prison of unknown causes in 1851. The revelation of the Hartwell family's true scope of crimes sent shockwaves through communities across America, where they had operated. Families who had trusted them with their most vulnerable moments realized they had been in the presence of calculating murderers. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in strangers, no matter how respectable they might appear. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, traveled to Oregon to witness Ezekiel Hartwell's execution and to finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for over 2 decades. The 2 men spoke briefly before the execution, and Hartwell expressed surprise that Dr. Harrison had survived his discovery in Milbrook, claiming that several other investigators over the years had not been so fortunate. In their final conversation, Hartwell revealed one last disturbing detail: the family had trained other individuals in their methods, apprentices who had established their own operations in various parts of the expanding nation. He claimed that at least 3 other families were continuing similar practices, but he refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. This revelation ensured that Dr. Harrison's remaining years would be spent in the knowledge that the evil he had discovered in Milbrook was still spreading across America. The Milbrook community never fully recovered from the revelation that their trusted neighbors had been systematic murderers. The town gradually declined as families moved away, unable to bear the weight of their shared history. By 1860, Milbrook had been abandoned entirely, and the forest began to reclaim the buildings where so much horror had been hidden today. Few records remain of the Hartwell family's crimes. The official reports were buried in government archives. The newspaper accounts were forgotten, and the communities they terrorized tried to erase all memory of their presence. But for those who study the darker chapters of American history, the Hartwell case serves as a reminder that evil can flourish anywhere hidden behind masks of respectability and protected by the very trust and innocence it seeks to destroy. The story of the Hartwell funeral. Parlor demonstrates how serial killers could operate with impunity in an era before modern communication and law enforcement coordination. It shows how predators could exploit the natural human trust that bound communities together, using that very trust as a weapon against their victims. Most importantly, it reveals how ordinary people, doctors, neighbors, family members, sometimes held the power to expose great evils, but only if they were willing to look beyond appearances and act on their suspicions. Dr. Harrison spent his final years documenting everything he had learned about the Hartwell case, hoping that his records might someday help other investigators recognize similar patterns of crime. He died in 1853, taking with him intimate knowledge of one of America's most horrifying family criminal enterprises. His detailed notes were discovered among his papers and eventually found their way into federal archives, where they remain today as testimony to crimes that shocked even the investigators who uncovered them. The legacy of the Hartwell family extends beyond their immediate victims to encompass the fundamental changes they brought to every community they touched. They destroyed the sense of security that had allowed small towns to function as extended families, replacing trust with suspicion and innocence with weariness. In this way, their impact on American society extended far beyond the individuals they murdered, touching the very fabric of community life in the expanding nation. This mystery shows us how easily evil can masquerade as respectability, and how the very institutions we trust for comfort during our darkest hours can sometimes harbor our worst nightmares. It forces us to question how well we truly know those around us, and how vigilant we must be in guarding against hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. The story of the Hartwell funeral parlor reminds us that even in times and places where community and faith seem unshakable, the darkness can still creep in unnoticed, feeding on human weakness and the blind acceptance of appearances. It warns us to never take safety or virtue for granted, because evil can wear any mask and find a home anywhere. As we close this chapter of horror and history, consider the chilling thought that the apprentices Ezekiel Hartwell spoke of might still be out there, carrying on his legacy in some forgotten town or shadowed corner of America. The past may be buried, but it is never truly gone, and sometimes it whispers warnings to those who listen carefully. Thank you for joining this journey into one of America's darkest family secrets. If this story unsettled you, please share it with someone who appreciates the mysteries that hide beneath history's surface. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so we can continue uncovering hidden truths together. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp, because the shadows of the past are never far behind. The revelation of the Hartwell family's crimes shattered the peaceful town of Milbrook, transforming a once close-knit community into a place of fear and suspicion. Families that had lived side by side for generations found themselves unable to trust their neighbors. The horror of realizing that murderers had walked among them for decades left deep wounds that no apology or explanation could heal. People began to question every unexplained death and every strange disappearance with a new lens of doubt. Any recalled odd behaviors and inconsistencies that they had once dismissed as harmless, but now appeared as sinister clues long buried in memory. The church, which had been a symbol of hope and unity, now felt like a place haunted by secrets that refused to die. The funeral home building itself became a grim reminder of the evil that had lurked in plain sight for so long. The once bustling establishment stood empty and foreboding, its windows boarded up and the basement sealed off. The townsfolk avoided it as if touching the walls might somehow summon the horrors contained within. Some whispered that strange noises could still be heard at night, and that shadows moved behind the boarded windows. Milbrook's decline was swift as families chose to leave, rather than face the painful legacy of betrayal and death. Those who remained lived in quiet dread, haunted by the memories of what had happened, and fearful that such darkness might return. The once vibrant streets became silent and overgrown. The forest reclaimed the homes where trust had been broken and innocence destroyed. This transformation was not just physical, but spiritual. The faith that had bound the community was fractured, replaced by a cynical wariness that stained every interaction. The shared rituals of mourning and celebration became strained with unspoken fears, and the once strong bonds of community began to unravel, leaving behind a cautionary tale etched into the town's very soul. Dr. Harrison continued his work, traveling from town to town, examining deaths with the scrutiny of a detective rather than a healer's. His experience with the Hartwell case had forever altered his approach, making him vigilant against the hidden evils that lurked beneath the surface of everyday life. Though some called him paranoid, he knew better that evil was real, and sometimes wore the most respectable faces. Years after the terror in Milbrook had faded into uneasy memory, Dr. Harrison received a letter that reignited the cold fire of his darkest suspicions. The letter came from a sheriff stationed in the distant Oregon Territory, a place far from the quiet hills of Pennsylvania, but where shadows of the Hartwell horrors still lingered. The sheriff wrote of a family named Caldwell, who had operated a funeral parlor in a small Oregon settlement for several years, before being uncovered in circumstances strikingly similar to those Dr. Harrison had documented decades earlier. The letter described suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and secret burial sites that mirrored the chilling patterns he had first witnessed in Milbrook. This new discovery proved that the evil was not confined to a single place, but had spread across the nation as the family moved westward, evading capture and leaving devastation in their wake. The sheriff's letter brought both grim confirmation and a renewed sense of urgency to Dr. Harrison's lifelong quest to stop them. The Caldwell family was, in fact, the Hartwell family, under new names, identities crafted to evade suspicion and continue their deadly work. With each new community they settled in, they refined their methods and expanded their reign of terror. Their crimes were no longer just local tragedies, but a sinister network of murder and deceit stretching across America. Despite their capture, the confession of the Hartwells revealed the full depth of their depravity, spanning nearly 3 decades and multiple states. Their victim count exceeded 120 individuals, making them among the most prolific and calculating serial killers in American history. Their pride in their macabre enterprise underscored the terrifying reality that they saw themselves as successful businessmen in an unusual trade. Dr. Harrison's encounter with Ezekiel Hartwell in Oregon before his execute. Ian was haunting Hartwell expressed surprise that the doctor had survived his investigation, claiming many others had not. This final meeting left Dr. Harrison with the chilling knowledge that the evil he had confronted was far from extinguished, that other families trained by the Hartwells continued their gruesome legacy, unseen and unchecked. The confession of Ezekiel Hartwell revealed that the murderous legacy of the family was not confined to themselves, but had spread like a dark contagion across the growing nation. He spoke of apprentices trained in the art of deception and murder, who had established their own deadly enterprises in distant towns and territories. This meant that the evil Dr. Harrison had uncovered was part of a larger network of horror operating in the shadows beyond the reach of law enforcement or public knowledge. The fear that gripped Milbrook was now a whisper carried on the wind across vast expanses of the American frontier families, who once believed in the goodness of strangers, now lived with an undercurrent of suspicion and dread. The Hartwell story became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a warning of how easily evil can hide behind the most respectable facades and infiltrate even the most trusting communities. Dr. Harrison dedicated his remaining years to uncovering the full extent of this network of murderers, tirelessly searching through records, following leads, and warning officials about the patterns he observed. Though his warnings were often dismissed or ignored, he never ceased to believe that exposing these hidden evils was vital to protecting innocent lives. The communities where the Hartwell family and their apprentices operated were forever altered by their presence. Death became a source of fear and mistrust, replacing acceptance and faith. The simple rituals of mourning were poisoned by suspicion and grief, as neighbors wondered who might have been the next victim concealed behind a friendly smile. The story of the Hartwell funeral parlor serves as a stark reminder that evil does not announce itself, that those who commit monstrous acts can wear the mask of normalcy, and that sometimes the greatest horrors lie not in isolated incidents, but in carefully orchestrated crimes hidden in plain sight. With Dr. Harrison's revelations shaking communities across Pennsylvania, the Hartwell family made a chilling decision to abandon Milbrook and seek refuge elsewhere. Their careful preparations suggested a ruthless determination to continue their sinister enterprise without interruption. Ezekiel Hartwell fabricated a story of a family emergency requiring immediate travel to Ohio, convincing neighbors to watch over their home while they were away. But this was no ordinary trip. The family meticulously destroyed incriminating evidence in the secret chamber and partially collapsed the underground cave system to conceal the countless victims hidden beneath their home. Their departure was as methodical as their crimes, leaving behind a ghost town haunted by the weight of their dark legacy. Dr. Harrison fled Milbrook exhausted and hunted using his knowledge of wilderness survival to evade capture. His medical bag held the last traces of evidence needed to alert authorities, but the family's reach and cunning meant that they had already anticipated his moves. The manhunt that followed was hindered by missing evidence and the community's reluctance to believe such evil could exist within their trusted neighbors. Despite his escape, Dr. Harrison knew that the heart of the darkness had not been destroyed, but had simply moved westward. Following the family's trail, he discovered a disturbing pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances that mirrored the horrors he had uncovered in Milbrook. His investigations took him across states and territories where the Hartwell family had reinvented themselves and continued their murderous acts under new names and identities. Dr. Harrison's relentless pursuit of the Hartwell family led him to Ohio, where reports of mysterious deaths and disappearances echoed the dark patterns he first uncovered in Milbrook. The family had cleverly adapted to new environments, adopting new identities, and establishing funeral businesses that served as fronts for their ongoing crimes. Each move westward brought fresh terror to unsuspecting communities who welcomed the seemingly respectable Hartwell kin without suspicion. The family's ability to blend in and manipulate those around them was as terrifying as their brutal acts themselves. Their reputation for professionalism and kindness masked the sinister reality that lurked beneath the surface. The trail of bodies and ruined lives extended through Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, with Dr. Harrison always arriving too late to prevent further murders. Despite his growing despair, he documented every detail, hoping to warn authorities and the public of the danger these traveling predators posed. The Hartwells became a haunting example of how evil could survive and thrive in a nation expanding rapidly into unknown territories where law enforcement was sparse and communication limited. Their story exposed the vulnerabilities of frontier life and the price of misplaced trust in an era before modern policing and forensic science. Milbrook never recovered from the shock of the Hartwell revelations. The town's fabric was torn apart by suspicion, fear, and grief. Families moved away, leaving behind empty homes and broken lives. The once close-knit community was replaced by a ghost town, slowly swallowed by the encroaching forest. The Hartwell funeral parlor building stood empty for years, a chilling reminder of the horrors that had transpired inside. Its basement was sealed, and no one dared to explore the cave system. Dr. Harrison's chilling account of the family's crimes was dismissed by many as paranoia or fantasy. But the scars remained etched deep in the memories of those who lived through the nightmare. The fear that had gripped Milbrook transformed the way people saw death and their neighbors. Death was no longer a natural passage, but a source of dread and suspicion. People questioned every unexplained disappearance, wondering if it had been caused by the evil they had unwittingly harbored among them. Dr. Harrison's relentless pursuit of truth led him beyond Milbrook, tracing the Hartwell family's murderous path across the expanding American frontier. His reports detailed similar patterns of disappearances, poisonings, and hidden graves in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. But always he arrived too late to stop the carnage. The Hartwells had become ghosts, moving westward, establishing new identities, and continuing their deadly trade. Years later in Oregon, authorities finally captured the family now living as the Caldwells and uncovered evidence confirming the full extent of their crimes. The family confessed to over 120 murders, spanning nearly 3 decades. Ezekiel Hartwell faced execution, his wife and sons received prison sentences, and the community was left grappling with the horror they had endured. Dr. Harrison witnessed Ezekiel's hanging in 1847 and spoke with him before his death. Hartwell admitted training other families in their sinister methods, leaving a chilling legacy of evil that could still be lurking in the shadows. The Hartwell case remains a dark chapter in American history, showing how evil can hide behind masks of respectability and how fragile trust can be in the face of true darkness.